Yeah, I was just browsing this book, Philosophy 101 by Cole Kleinman. Um, yeah, there's some interesting things to dig into at different points. I'd have to get some books, but over the years, I want to have a bit of a reference. Not all the philosophers in there seemed interesting. I've heard of them. I've heard of most of them over the years, but they're um, they're mixed. Some of their stuff isn't particularly original, but it was popular or whatever, and some of it I don't agree with, um, which mostly determines my interest in the first place. The one I kind of really object to is Karl Marx being in there. Um, yes, you could say that his philosophies, broadly speaking, were very much practiced, but I think that that's just a label that people sort of put on there because there's different types of Marxism, and there's different words people use to describe these ideals. I happen to believe that it's a blight on the face of humanity. The reasons are because it's a rebellion against man ordering himself, and it's fighting the notion that humans are not equal. And I'm not talking about anything about intrinsic worth. That's a bit of a There tends to be a bit of a soft-headed notion that it doesn't really go anywhere. It isn't substantive. We all have worth. It can't be measured in a way. Like you could try to do it in a utilitarian way, which is disastrous. But other than that, other than money or something else of tangible value, it's hard to determine the value that a human has in society, except that we know that that most humans have it, and some have a lot more than others. You could say soft value in a way. Women are, in most societies, are particularly noted for this. There are things that are considered profoundly impactful, profoundly enriching, that women are more likely to do, or more likely to do better than men, that don't earn as much money, generally speaking. That's really all it comes down to. It's people who are dissatisfied, and they do things out of spite, and they do things out of entitlement, and they do things because they believe they're building something. Many communists, well, I shouldn't say communists, but we call them that. They call themselves, some of them call themselves that. But many socialists, enforced socialists, they had to say they believed in this because there really wasn't an alternative. And the party looked for ideological purity or lack thereof, and punished and sometimes rewarded accordingly. So, in a country like Russia and other parts of the USSR, that was largely the only way to achieve social mobility, which is actually what humans like to do. It's our nature. I'm sure it's been touched on before. I think I haven't read about it, but the will to power idea that Nietzsche had, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but that we want to do stuff, and that's what drives us. We are driven to achieve. Is most notable in men because many times because war is a very obvious example of this. Men do it men have measurable success in that career as well, other things, accomplishments, buildings. But this is universal. There's outliers who don't particularly want to achieve tangible things in life other than whatever their personal goals might be. There might not be a lot of outward evidence for it. But again, those are outliers. Mostly, it's the well, that's kind of what drives human society. It's not just competition with one another. That's an ego thing. It's actually less. It's just the idea of accomplishing something, and whatever that means for the individuals and the groups. That's what unites groups, not competition one against the other, in my opinion. There's exceptions, and that's actually closer than many of the other comparisons, because achievement wraps up a lot of human potential. It can wrap up a lot of our egos. It can really have an impact on society. Whereas competition, well, that's comparison, and yeah, that comes up sometimes. But a lot of times when people say, "Don't compare yourself to others," we do it anyways. It's a reflex. It's not. I don't really believe in trying to repress one's nature. I think that mistakes are the result of ignorance, essentially, and bad habits that people have learned, and partly our nature as well. That some people have a propensity for violence, for alcoholism, for drug abuse, for all sorts of things, good and bad. Some people have a propensity for kindness, for generosity, for altruism. So it's and usually it's pretty mixed. But the ones that are negative, you got to ask how it impacts others. Most of the time, but as people get more experience, they ask and answer, how does that relate to the self, who they want to be, how they see themselves, and that's actually where morality comes from. Yes, we're taught because we're around other people. We're taught ethics. We also learn to shape our own character, but it's yeah. We have to come up with our own ideas as it relates to how we actually do things, because if we don't, then we end up copying others, and copying others is a really bad idea. Usually, we have to learn emulation, and that's how we form our own habits. We learn what works for ourselves because we know ourselves better than anyone else. Yeah, and that brings me to the other point. I don't really like schools of thought. Of course, I follow some. That's the nature of having opinions, but I really don't like them. They studying philosophy would normally imply studying schools of thought, and some of them aren't worthy of study. Oh, how can I know that? Well, there's so many that it's impossible really to study all of them in a lifetime. As I said, most are derivative, so there's no need to study them because they're going over ground that's already been covered very thoroughly and in great depth. Now, yes, there's, you could say, tweaks, but to fit into a modern era, different ways of saying the same thing. But um, yeah, I guess that brings me to another point. I don't know the name of all that many philosophers, although I've touched upon people's work as I've come across it from reading. But it seems that there's only maybe a dozen or so that I've ever even like registered their names. Yeah, and I find usually that the wiser people tend to kind of emulate different philosophies, or adopt different philosophies, not just one. Um, Unless they have a very unusual life, but it's usually several. I'm sure I practice several different types of, well, categories of philosophy. I'm sure people would label them different ways, but I don't really find that particularly useful, because human thought is too unique. Basically, we love to create, and really, I'm not interested in studying something that has to be memorized to remember it. I'd rather have something that is self-apparent. Like I would say Buddhism is self-apparent to me, at least, or most of it, and Stoicism as well. And there's others too that, well, yeah, but yeah, just because something's popular doesn't mean it's original or even particularly useful. It's just sort of a framework that people use to for some end, and that's where that's where Marxists come in. They use certain things for an end. And yes, it can point to all sorts of injustices and inequalities and such. Inequality is good, though, up to a certain point, I suppose. I think when people are dealing with monopoly, the it should be about how high the floor is, not how low the ceiling is. And other things as well. I think there should be social mobility, but that doesn't mean that there's much in the way. You shouldn't try to change equality of outcome, I don't think. Because people are usually, if there's an even playing field, then people usually end up where they're supposed to. And people who don't see it that way tend to think in a very similar way, one to the other. They tend to be ideologically driven. In my experience, they tend to think that there's some form of unfairness, and yes, there is, in a way, but that's in an absolute sense. And I also don't believe that people who are located in one area or another should be obligated to help those in another area, because what that ends up being is supporting organizations that use the resources as they see fit. It's not direct support, and even if it was, we're obligated more to our community than to the global community, in my opinion. And people who see it differently, they tend to have a sort of view that we're all on this planet together, and if we manage to get the floor up under everyone so everyone can have something, it can have a life and some platform to progress, then we can make the world a much better place, the species a much better species. But that touches on themes of utilitarianism, which is a horrifying philosophy when taken to extremes. It says that humans are just part of a machine, and you should treat people like a machine. And people become numbers, not individuals. They lose personhood. That notion, and now if someone wants to volunteer, that could be a noble thing. It's probably a good thing, but they shouldn't be obligated to. You can't instill civic virtue by force. Yeah, there's practice and example and repetition and all of that, but it doesn't. It'll just stir. More often than not, it will stir resentment for those forcing this upon people. Now, that's not to say that things like probation or community service fall into that category, because the individuals brought that upon themselves. So this is at best, it's a natural consequence, but too often it's treated as a punishment, which it's not. Justice should be impartial, but humans aren't. So there you go. Yeah. And I guess that's why yeah, people want I think an arbiter, but that's you got to grow that sort of thing within the community. You can't say someone else will rescue me, someone else will save me, must save me, so must save us. That's actually what Russia is doing wrong, and has been for a very long time. They look for the great man, and yeah, they've had great leaders in their past, and they have helped their country a lot, but the great man doesn't last. And you got to put all your hope in. You got to put a disproportionate amount of hope in that individual, in that, and what they represent. But what they represent already exists in society. There could be more than one, more than a few. It has to be a community. It has to be a lot of communities moving together to change a nation. But a community must also be allowed to change themselves and set an example, or at least not be burdened by the mistakes of the surrounding communities. But therein lies the problem, and we have this problem in America too, but to a lesser extent. We don't have a lot of corruption in most areas. It varies widely by state, but we're pretty good at that. And our federal government is, well, there's a lot of opinions on it, but I happen to believe that it is much too large, and it does more, at least unnecessary work or harm than good, even though the essential functions, of course, must continue. Yeah, so a lot of people kind of seem to think the federal government's about the right size, but it just needs to work better. And I suppose I agree with them, at least on the second part. But yeah, because if you have that much power with that little accountability, there's bound to be at least laziness, and laziness makes rot, and rot makes corruption. So, I mean, other things make corruption too, but laziness is a big one.